Bonjour, hello, bienvenue à cette webinaire de la chaire sur les décompensations. Moi, c'est Mark Purdon, je suis le titulaire de la chaire. On va juste attendre quelques minutes en cours pour laisser les gens rentrer dans la salle virtuelle. Bonjour, hi. This presentation is going to be in English, but my name is Mark Purdon. I'm the holder of the chair in decarbonization here at UQAM, and we will be starting our presentation by Jeroen van den Bergh in just a moment. The title of this talk is Misguided Resistance to Carbon Pricing. Professor van den Bergh is joining us from Barcelona, where it's the evening. He is affiliated with, as he'll be able to better explain perhaps, Universitat Autònoma de Barcelona, as well as the VU University Amsterdam. And I guess he might present himself as an environmental economist, but without perhaps, I think perhaps maybe Professor van den Bergh would be in a better position to introduce himself and his affiliations. So Professor van den Bergh, the virtual floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mark. So I'm going to talk today about carbon pricing, and especially the criticism on it. This is something that interests me because I feel that we as scientists need to give the best advice to policymakers and society, and I think we're not succeeding in that. In the natural sciences, I think there's a lot of agreement on climate change now, but on climate policy, the social scientists and policy scientists are quite divided. And that's understandable because we have quite separated disciplines. In the natural sciences, there's much more integration, logical integration from physics to chemistry to biology to engineering sciences. But in the social sciences, we live next to each other. Sometimes we cooperate, we read each other, sometimes we criticize each other. I think for this field, it's extremely important to try to see where we can agree better. So I'm an environmental economist with a broad interest. I have worked for, I don't know how many years, don't want to know, 25 years or longer on environmental economics. In the last 10 years, maybe a little bit longer, I decided to focus more on climate change and climate policy because it's clearly the biggest challenge for humanity, and a lot of other problems derive from it or correlated with it. So this is really the huge challenge for humanity. So I will start with this slide, which shows the history of CO2 emissions and the predicted warming by various models. So if you see the left graph, it's clear that we're not reducing emissions so far at a global level. And they still have a slightly upward trend. And what you see is changing is the composition. And that is important because that means that countries which contribute relatively a lot to emissions at this moment are changing. Importance of contributors is changing, and that should be reflected also by actions and policies in the different countries. So it's clear that we have the Paris Agreement with the targets of 1.5 to 2 degrees. In order to succeed that, we need a rapid transition to zero or even negative annual emissions. To achieve that, it's clear that we need an effective and stringent policy, and arguably, and I will argue that here in detail, serious regulation and or carbon pricing. And I will argue why we need carbon pricing, why regulation alone cannot do it. If you look at the second graph, especially the yellow bars, you see that the Paris pledges will result in 2 to 3 degrees warming. That's the expectations from various models. But since we don't have consistent policies, these expectations are even optimistic. And we cannot exclude warming up to 4 degrees. And that's really extreme climate change. Imagine, we have now achieved only 1.2 degrees warming at the global level. So we're in for quite some changes in the future. So I want to talk about the resistance to carbon pricing, one of the instruments that in my view we need to make a big change. And this resistance is found within the social sciences, the political and policy sciences, and the environmental sciences. I will argue that that resistance is largely misguided. I will focus on 5 issues. First of all, I have the feeling that a lot of critics undervalue theoretical arguments that come mainly from economics. I also have the impression, if I read the critics, that they ignore or downplay evidence for emissions reduction or misinterpret it. Then I think what is disregarded not only by the critics but by many others who influence the policy making on climate is that systemic effects are overlooked, and this is important if we want to achieve deep decarbonization, of course. Then critics tend to, all of them almost, overstate political barriers to carbon pricing. And finally, very importantly, I think, they fail to offer a systematic comparison of instruments on the basis of criteria that really shows fairly and coldly, without emotions, which instruments are really doing well. So then I want to say something about the sources of resistance and the potential response strategies at the very end. Just to motivate why I think this is important, I think by overcoming misguided resistance, we can have a better quality debate and increase support for carbon pricing, and also how it should be designed. This will foster harmonization of stringent climate policy, and that hopefully can lead to a rapid and smooth low carbon transition at the global scale. So there is a paper which is unpublished. It's a working paper. If you're interested, it can be shared. So the collection of critics or criticisms is here in the left column of this table. It's a diversity of papers, of authors. Some are published in journals, specialized field journals, some in highly ranked journals, and others in popular magazines with a good reputation. So that means these criticisms, in principle, can reach a large audience and have a lot of impact. So some of the criticisms have received already responses in the form of other articles. You can see that in the right column. And some of the arguments that I will present here derive, of course, from some of these sources. So I start with theoretical arguments. Well, as you know, in economics, we have a strong theoretical tradition, which economists see as positive. That means we think logically, using mathematics, using rigor about issues, and then derive from that strong ideas that might be tested empirically. So I would say that theoretically and also partly empirically, there are 5 classic arguments for carbon pricing. First idea is that it internalizes external environmental costs in all economic decisions. And these external costs means that there are costs for others on the planet, in the economy, in society, which are not taken into account. And that's why private costs and associated private decisions do not account for all the social impacts of economic decisions. And that's not good, of course. That's an old idea that goes back to Bergh at the beginning of the 20th century. And I think the idea of externalities is broadly supported, although in economics we are more enthusiastic about it. But I could give a lecture separately about why externalities is such a useful concept. And there are different types of externalities, positive, negative, monetary, technical, physical, symmetric ones. There are many types of externalities. So symmetric, asymmetric, well, I could go on. In any case, second argument is that through carbon pricing and in general environmental pricing, we change relative prices of the desirable and undesirable goods and services. In this case, in the climate case, of high and low carbon goods and services. And therefore you push everybody who makes decisions on the basis of prices to reconsider their old decisions and improve their decisions for the climate. Third, carbon pricing selects the cheapest emission reduction options in the economy by this pricing pressure. And that means that at the end of the day, we will have the cheapest solutions to reduce emissions. Now, many may think, well, it doesn't interest me so much, but a lot of the resistance against climate solutions is because it is expensive or because it's seen as expensive. So if we can make it cheaper, there will be less resistance and the transition can be following a smoother path. The fourth argument is that carbon pricing decentralizes regulation, and specifically governments don't need to know all the options that producers and consumers have to change their behavior and reduce emissions. And they don't need, the government also doesn't need to know the costs of those options. And if they would ask especially the producers about that, probably they would get a lot of half-lies or non-information, and therefore it's better to decentralize than to ask information. Imagine also that there are thousands to millions worldwide producers that would have to be asked. So that's also not a strategy that's very pragmatic. You would need a huge government for that if you didn't decentralize. And then finally, there's a permanent incentive for both technological adoption and innovation. And that because this price incentive is continuously there. If you have a standard, for instance, then once the standard is met, there is no incentive to go further than that. And there is also evidence that environmental innovation trajectories will be misguided if prices are wrong. Well, these are the classic arguments, but I think there are additional reasons for carbon pricing which need more attention, because I think these classic arguments are insufficient to convince a lot of non-economists. So first of all, an issue that I will elaborate later, in order to be able to compare and to coordinate policies internationally among countries, carbon pricing is the easiest instrument. Why is that? Well, because you can see a price, you can see the tax level in different countries and immediately see which country has the highest tax. So for instance, it is widely known now that the country with the highest carbon tax is Sweden. I will later say more about it because it's not completely true if you do the corrections, but it still has a high carbon tax. Norway is in fact the country that has the highest carbon tax in the world. And it's interesting to see then that carbon pricing could be a way to avoid free riding, because if you can coordinate countries' policies, you can avoid free riding. Also something that I will elaborate later. Secondly, with carbon pricing, you not only control direct emissions, but indirect emissions, because product prices and services and their prices will reflect the emissions through the price and costs over the whole life cycle and production chain. And standards don't do that. Standards just say this is the good product to buy, but it doesn't mean that it's the best product. For instance, we might have standards and then look at the price and buy Chinese solar PV panels, the best ones. No, they're produced with carbon emissions from coal. And so if you would have a price correction in that to that extent, they would become expensive and unattractive. And then, only then, consumers and producers would get the right signal. Of course, most emissions are generated through market decisions. And that's also a simple practical reason to say, let's have a price correction, because that works well in markets. Also, if you have this price correction, you don't need a separate life cycle analysis. You don't need information on products in the form of labels to indicate how pollutive products are. Through the price mechanism, the carbon costs over the whole production cycle will be integrated through the financial accounting by firms. And of course, through carbon pricing, all decisions, really no exception, if we do it well, all decisions will change a little. And that means we spread the costs very broadly, and that will lead to a very flexible and smooth transition without too much damage. There may still be people hurt and sectors having a hard time, but it's probably the smoothest transition you can imagine. And then overlooked, pricing generates revenues for compensating poor households, and it's the only instrument that does that. And finally, I will say something about that later or soon. It shifts revenues from the OPEC to the oil importing countries. So it is in fact amazing that one instrument, carbon pricing, has so many advantages. And I think that's not sufficiently appreciated. And I wonder why it is. I can understand it has to do with the fact that this instrument is seen as something from economics, a discipline that is not the one that many of the critics come from. But I think we should be very cold and rational in our analysis of instruments. If an instrument has so many advantages, we should cherish that. So critics are often negative about economic theorizing. But let's be honest, theoretical rigor and logic can identify sharp insights, overlook benefits of an instrument, in this case, in particular, carbon pricing. So I have two illustrations here. The papers are mentioned below. A paper by Liu elaborates a novel argument in the debate about the environmental taxes and argues that carbon taxes are more difficult to evade than income taxes, because income is difficult to observe and there is still a lot of tax evasion regarding income. But carbon taxes, or carbon pricing in general, would be levied on physical, material energy resources, fossil fuels. You cannot evade flows of fossil fuels. They're huge, so it will be much more easier to control the taxes on these. And hence shifting of the taxes from income to carbon will reduce tax evasion. That's a nice side benefit of carbon taxation. So the author did an empirical application and found that the welfare costs of carbon taxation decrease considerably. So these tax evasion reduction effects, they compensate welfare costs. And the percentages you see here, ranging from 28% for the United States to even close to 100% for India. Another interesting theoretical study by Liskia and Tavonen investigated how carbon taxation would work, given that the OPEC is a cartel and raises prices. And they found that part of the policy burden would shift to the OPEC cartel. In fact, we would reduce the margin for profit making by the OPEC cartel by having a carbon price, and therefore we would keep part of the benefits. And that's absolutely also a good thing, because a lot of the money in the OPEC goes to very rich people who then invest that money in football clubs and raise the salary of football players. You know, that's how the world is connected. So the second criticism that I want to look at is that many of the critics ignore or downplay the evidence for emissions reduction. So there are a lot of studies. I could identify close to 30 studies of a very different character, studies that use reviews, studies that focus on multi-country analysis, studies that use single country analysis, studies that focus on international transport, and studies that focus on innovation effects. And I just want to mention 3 studies here. One is by Bergh and a co-author. I made a mistake here, there's a second author. For the OECD, and it found that a €1 increase in energy taxes reduces fossil fuel-based carbon emissions by 0.73%. So that means a negative elasticity of 0.73, and that's good. That's fairly high. Another study, one of the most ambitious, by Best et al., considered 142 countries. So that's a big proportion of the total countries in the world, which are 195, of which 43 had a carbon price during some time. And then it allowed a comparative analysis, and it found that the average annual growth of CO2 emissions was about 2% lower in countries with a carbon price. And again, it could estimate an elasticity, which in this case was minus 0.3. Then a third study for the EU ETS, and there are several studies in this respect, found that it avoided 1.2 billion tons of CO2 emissions, equivalent to almost 4% of total emissions, and in certain sectors up to 20%. EU ETS is, of course, the biggest emission permit market in the world. I will say more about it later. Of course, there's a whole literature, an older literature, on the relationship between energy prices and investments in energy efficiency and innovation. And that's very relevant because carbon pricing will work to a large extent through raising energy prices, specifically, of course, of carbon intensive energy sources. Pop is an important author in this respect, did good reviews and early studies, and found a very strong effect of energy prices, higher energy prices, on energy efficiency investments and innovation. So that immediately translates also to carbon pricing, but there's also a lot of specific studies now for carbon pricing that find similar results. So generally, you could summarize this literature as finding a high relative effect, this elasticity of emission reduction responding as a response to prices, but of course a limited absolute effect because carbon prices are low yet in the world, and I will talk more about that later. So a third issue that peeps up in many of the critics is the issue of deep decarbonization. And it's suggested that with carbon pricing, you cannot achieve deep decarbonization. And therefore, some say that we shouldn't have carbon pricing, or others say carbon pricing is not so important. Well, I agree with both, and I would even argue that we can do it alone with carbon pricing, but I'm also in favor, as I will later explain, of other instruments, but we have to think hard about how to do that, of course. So my point is more general here. I see that a lot of the critics disregard systemic effects, and that's why also they are a bit pessimistic about carbon pricing. So systemic effects have to do with that earlier point which I made, that carbon pricing is able to control indirect effects, and I think that's insufficiently appreciated. Carbon pricing is really the only instrument that signals to users, to purchasers and users of technology, and people that buy services that also use energy in their production phase, that there are emissions along the whole chain of activities. And a concept that's very much related to this is energy rebound. And it's interesting that some of the critics are also worried about energy rebound, but they don't make the connection with carbon pricing, because there are several studies now that suggest that carbon pricing is really the only instrument that can control energy rebound, because energy rebound in essence is a response to lower energy scarcity and lower energy costs. And because of that, people, producers and consumers will use technologies more intensively or save money and spend that money on something else, which also triggers energy use somewhere else in the chain. So carbon pricing is a great instrument to control energy rebound, which might have been responsible for considerable disappointment of energy and emissions reduction, even though we have a lot of energy policies and climate policies already in place. And as a result, many of the critics, they refer to other instruments which they like: industrial policy, innovation policy, standards, regulation, but these don't control for rebound effects. You can see that in a way, because if you buy, for instance, a new technology that is subject to a standard, okay, then the standard affects your purchase behavior. But then in the use phase, because you have a lower use cost, you may rebound. And the standard doesn't control that. In fact, the standard stimulated that. So then if you have carbon pricing, the use phase will become more expensive, and that will compensate for the cheaper use, and therefore rebound is controlled. With subsidies, it's even worse, because if you have adoption subsidies, you make the cost of use even cheaper, and therefore you stimulate rebound even more. So strangely enough, you could see adoption subsidies as a pricing instrument or a monetary financial instrument, but it ideally would need also carbon pricing to avoid carbon rebound. So there's mounting evidence now for high macro level rebound. That means if we look at all the effects summed together, intensity of use, shifting expenditures, market effects, macroeconomic effects, and recent reviews indicate that more than 50% rebound is quite common, and that even more than 100% is not uncommon. So that means we have to take rebound very seriously. Doesn't mean we don't have to focus on energy efficiency and energy conservation, but we have to control it well and make it effective with rebound policy, meaning carbon pricing. And again, I give the example of PV panels. Many people buy those of China now, but they're very pollutive in terms of CO2 emissions in the production cycle. The ones from Germany and the US are cleaner. I did a study myself, which compared this. And if we don't have carbon pricing, then everybody will think that PV panels are clean technologies. No, they are not. They pollute a lot before you buy them. And the same applies to wind turbines, which are complex technologies with a lot of metals. That there will also be a lot of emissions throughout the production cycle and also later during the recycling process. Same for electric vehicles. If we don't have carbon pricing, a lot of people are going to make wrong choices, and they will only focus on emissions during the use phase and not during the production phase or the recycling phase. Interestingly, also, there are other systemic effects that complicate the picture. So there is a study by York, mentioned below, in Nature Climate Change, which shows that in the last 50 years, low carbon energy sources have not really displaced a lot of fossil fuel energy. In fact, they have displaced less than 1/4 of these. And if you look at fossil fuel electricity, only 1/10. And that has to do with subsidies and the lack of carbon pricing. We haven't discouraged fossil fuel energy use. We have subsidized it. We have made energy cheaper. And as a result, we have mainly used low carbon and renewable energy sources for fulfilling increasing energy demand, both in rich countries and developing countries. So going to deep decarbonization, something that many critics mention as a concern, and it should be a concern, but they automatically say carbon pricing is not going to achieve that because it hasn't achieved much emission reduction so far. Well, that is because the prices have, first of all, not been implemented well, and secondly, they're still low. And it means also, if you look at the first emission curve that I showed, that no instrument has been able to reduce emissions a lot so far. So carbon pricing is not unique in this. It holds for all instruments. We have a lot of standards that are not very effective. Think of Dieselgate, but think also of standards that are applied for groups of products like the luxury cars, expensive cars. In the world of car production, the standards have been categorized. So there's no single standard for all the cars. There are subtle standards there, and that's the result of lobbying of countries and industries, of course. So again, since carbon pricing affects all the decisions, if it's well implemented by producers, consumers, investors, and innovators, it will limit rebound. It will reduce emissions everywhere. Nothing escapes the influence of carbon pricing. It's a systemic instrument. And hence, as a result, a critical price threshold exists that will act as a tipping point to shift our society relatively quickly to a low carbon economy. But of course, we have to increase the price, and that's not easy. And I will talk about how to do that. One last comment. You see the comment in red to the right. That's a very important, subtle issue that's also not realized by many people, I have the feeling. So if you have standards, then you suggest there are clean and dirty technologies. And if you follow the standard, you buy the product that satisfies the standard, you buy a clean technology. But that's not true. There is no clean technology. All technologies are still quite dirty. An electric vehicle reduces emissions versus traditional combustion engines with maybe 30%, 40, 50%, depending on the car, depending on where the electricity comes from, but not with 90 or 100%. It's not close to zero emissions. And carbon pricing recognizes that. Carbon pricing will signal that technology is not clean, but a standard suggests that it's clean. And therefore, carbon pricing is more subtle and more honest, really. So then a lot of critics, that's the next point, overstate political barriers. This is a very common criticism. You find it almost in all the articles and books that argue against carbon pricing. And of course, they say two things: or carbon pricing in general meets much resistance, or high carbon prices meet resistance. But I think the first statement is not supported by the evidence. If you look at the World Bank carbon pricing dashboard, which is here, you see that there are 70 initiatives in 47 jurisdictions. So that's quite a lot. That's more. That's more than one quarter of the world, or let's say it's a quarter of the world. Of course, it's true that stringent non-price instruments don't count on political support, except in the EU, where we have the EU ETS with fairly high prices. But we also see that other instruments don't have a stringent level. And that's because there's a lot of lobbying for standards. What's interesting also is that we see that large oil companies have expressed that they support carbon pricing because they see this as an instrument that could be harmonized and could create a level playing field internationally. And they also see that as something that is good. So you might not like that, but if you feel that they have a lot of influence, why not get them on your side? Of course, political feasibility should be seen in a more subtle context. So that's my third bullet point here. Political feasibility should be judged for a rising scheme of carbon pricing, not for an immediate high price. And below is mentioned a study that we published in Global Environmental Change earlier this year, which shows that if you build it up carefully, you can increase support. So this is a very ambitious study with multiple connected models, with opinion dynamics based on empirical data. And we find that if you build up the support carefully, then people see the consequences. If they don't look so bad, then people are increasing their support, and people who already gave their support are willing to support a higher price. And this is also found by exposed evidence in British Columbia, for instance, that this is a realistic scenario. Of course, a lot of pessimism about implementing carbon pricing, if you look at the literature, arises from the United States. But I would say it's more general. A lot of pessimism about support for climate policy broadly comes from the USA, because there it has been, among all the rich developed countries, most difficult to get the support. And of course, I can not avoid to mention the famous yellow vest protest in France, because a lot of critics mentioned this also as an important example showing that carbon pricing meets a lot of resistance. But of course, it was triggered by bad design and bad information provision. It went along with the cancelling of a wealth tax. Revenues were not recycled to compensate the most affected ones. And there was an incorrect impression given that the whole system was regressive, which was also not true. And there have been several studies done. I should have mentioned this, but I was busy at the last moment with many slides and haven't done that. Sorry for that. But there were 2 studies published, empirical studies, looking at people's opinions. And they found that people were quite positive if they got more information, and people didn't understand the instrument well, which suggests that we can do a better job here. So once more about this overview from the World Bank. Positive about this is that many countries already have experience with the carbon tax or market. Negative is that carbon price levels are low, and that also emissions coverage is incomplete often. So the price level doesn't say how much of the economy is really covered by it, or how much of the sectors where the price is applied is covered by it. And unilateral carbon taxes and markets won't escape this shortcoming, because that's part of free riding. Implementing a low price is easy, but going to a high price is not easy on your own, because this will harm your competitive position. So here I have a graph based on an earlier published study in this year with a student, where we looked at how we should judge the prices, because in our view there are the advertised prices, the nominal prices on the one hand, and on the other hand you have the real average prices weighted for emissions that they apply to. And so you can see here, for instance, the gray prices are the published prices, the advertised prices. The purple price in this case is, or the pink prices, or here the blue prices, are the average prices. If you look at the emissions that they apply to, you see they're considerably lower. In fact, here we have Sweden with the highest nominal advertised price, but with the third highest average price. Norway and Switzerland are a little bit higher. And what you also see in this graph is that the purple are countries which have both a carbon tax and a carbon market. Those are all countries part of the EU where you have the joint carbon market, the emissions trading system, and where some countries have added the carbon tax to other activities and sectors and products. Pink is where there's only the carbon market, blue is where there's only carbon taxes. And what you see that in general, carbon taxes lead to a lower level than carbon markets. And that may be because carbon markets don't say beforehand how high the price will be, whereas a carbon tax you have to decide, and then there will be more resistance. So this suggests that a carbon market is not a bad idea. And I will later give other arguments for that. This is the same set of countries where you now see these average carbon prices. Well, I wanted to say also here something was also interesting. So the mean price for the whole sample here of 31 countries is less than 8 euros per ton of CO2. The mean price gap is almost 60%. That means 60% is not covered by what it's suggested to cover. And that means carbon pricing is still relatively badly implemented. The positive thing is that the effectiveness, which I talked about before in the empirical studies, these elasticities, they're probably higher in reality, because these studies looked at these advertised prices as if they were the real prices, but the real prices that are really the average prices, which are lower. So you may underestimate the effectiveness of carbon pricing. And here also another data, if you look at the whole world, the average carbon price is probably closer to $1 per ton of CO2. This comes from another study by Dolphin et al. In Oxford Economic Papers, which is very low because most countries and most emissions don't have carbon price. Of course, this is before China implemented the carbon market, so that's now already probably higher. And then this picture compares the carbon prices, the average carbon prices in green, with other energy taxes that implicitly carbon price, but they don't do it really specifically. They're not so good, not so effective. And you see that most of the pressure on reducing emissions comes from these energy taxes, not from the genuine carbon prices. And that's a pity, because the genuine carbon prices would do it better. Because, for instance, now you have energy taxes on diesel and gasoline, but these taxes do not reflect the carbon content. So you could reform your taxes, and that would be really the first place for governments to start. Make sure that all this blue becomes green. That's an easy step to take. You don't change your revenues, your tax revenues a lot. Consumers will not notice it that much, and people will be stimulated to shift to the fuels that are better for climate. So why don't we do this? Let's do that. Okay, now I come to an issue that really is very important to my lecture, because I think also I have the understanding that I'm talking to political scientists to some extent in this group, and that's interesting. Because I've read a lot of articles that suggest that we see the world, the reality different, and we should talk about that. So from my perspective, how I've been educated, a solution to climate change is so hard because we have an unusual problem. And there are two main reasons for that. First, we have an economy with a high use of fossil fuel energy, and that fossil fuel energy is locked in. There's no easy substitute for that at short notice. And even this substitute, if it's renewable energy, will use up a lot of carbon emissions before we are there. And secondly, the more important problem in my view that we have to talk about, climate is a public good. That means there's no rivalry. We can use it together, and more importantly, we cannot be excluded from it. That's positive because we can enjoy the weather, the nice weather, but it's also negative. If there's climate damages, they fall upon us. We cannot evade them. And as an implication, the solution to climate change will also affect everybody, because that means going from climate change to less climate change, or to not so fast climate change. And therefore, yeah, the solution to climate change is also a public good. And that's a public good in which we have, at the country level, 195 players. So that's a complex public good. And Scott Barrett, the economist, I would say, who's the most expert on international negotiations for climate and also other problems, he can compare different types of problems. He looked at diseases, at arms negotiations, at the ozone depletion, etc. So, and he says very clearly, climate change is probably the most difficult collective action problem in human history. And to understand that, if climate were a private good owned by one person or one country, it would be very quickly solved. Why? Because that country would see the cost, would see that if it would avoid climate change, all that cost would be reduced for itself, and therefore the cost and the benefits would be traded off, and it would be clear that the costs are going to be very high in the future and you're going to benefit from it by reducing emissions. But by having a public good, it's not that simple. The benefits fall onto others, onto many others. And therefore the rational strategy of governments is to free ride. The costs are not worth the benefits. We see that at the individual level. Individuals are not going to sacrifice their car, their luxury house, travel, holidays, because it's a big sacrifice. And therefore, they see that the benefits are very small. If an individual does that, you cannot even notice these benefits. Even a small country does it. Countries like the Netherlands, Spain, they're 1% countries. They contribute 1% to emissions approximately. Belgium, there are many of those countries. Switzerland, Austria. If they reduce, even Canada is not a big country. Okay, geographically it's big, but Canada economically and in emissions is not so very big. So if it reduces its emissions a bit, you won't notice it at the global level. It's in the uncertainty range of measurement. And that explains why we're not sacrificing easily. That explains free riding. So any solution to climate change needs to limit free riding among countries and among individuals, but first among countries, because only then we can have policies at the national level that can control free riding among individuals within those countries. And if you don't believe that, well, at the country level, there's still a lot of worry in governments about the competitive position, about economic growth, about important energy dependent sectors that will be hurt. So the evidence is all around us. And the past climate negotiations illustrate it also clearly. Again, Barrett, in a science article below mentioned, says it very clearly. The disjunction between what countries say and what they do has been repeated every year since the first summit in '95. See now the last summit in Egypt, negotiations for a climate fund. But that climate fund was promised already in Paris 7 years ago, and we're still not finished with discussing it. The promises were big, but the reality is that countries don't meet their promises. They go back home and then they have problems. Barack Obama made big promises and he couldn't get support at home. Yeah, that's all because of free riding, selfish behavior of countries. So overcoming this free riding requires collective action of countries. And there are 3 options basically for that. Global governance, a global government really, but we don't have that. An international agreement that's effective, we don't have that either. The Paris Agreement is not that. I will discuss it in a moment. For an international agreement that's effective, you need punishment, you need compensation, you need probably linking with other issues like international trade. And a third way for collective action is a climate club that can expand over time. And I think, and several others, that that's our best chance. So I will say something about that as well. And yeah, if you want to have collective action that is effective, you need carbon pricing. That's another argument that economists have. And Weitzman is an important person in this respect, mentioned below. He has written about that and explained why carbon pricing is the easiest to compare internationally and the easiest to harmonize, both in an agreement or in a club. And that's why any future with collective action to overcome free riding will have to go through carbon pricing. It will not work with a complex set of standards because these are very difficult to harmonize among countries. So I said already, the Paris Agreement has not overcome free riding. And why is that? Well, because there is a diversity of interests among countries. There are rich countries, there are poor countries. there are fossil fuel suppliers and importers. So countries have very different interests, and it's very difficult to make them agree. And you see that in the pledges. This is a summary of the pledges in 4 categories. And we don't have to go into the details. So if you look at the vertical axis, if you're above the horizontal axis, you are still emitting in your pledge. If you're below, if the center of your circle, which says how much you emit, is below the horizontal axis, you are reducing emissions. You see that most countries, especially in yellow, green, and blue, they are above the axis, and that means emissions are going to increase. And even among the richer countries in the orange, several are still close to 0 or above, and they haven't implemented policies consistent with their pledges. So it looks worse even than this pledge summary. So the Paris Agreement is no definite solution to climate change, and it doesn't look like it's going to do better. We can improve the pledges. That will be difficult. That has been difficult. We've done it a little bit, but the policies implemented are not consistent with it. And then we have even carbon leakage from the rich to the poor countries. And this is what I studied with colleagues recently. So here we have a study with all the country pledges. We look at carbon leakage, we look at rebound, and we look at uncertainty about negative emission technologies. And what we find is that all the studies that so far have been reporting on how much warming we get from the Paris Agreement, which they estimate them between 2 and 3 degrees, they are optimistic. We find that with a 50% chance, 2 degrees warming will be reached 3 decades earlier than under the scenario that you implement your pledges. So it looks all much more pessimistic. What you also see in the Paris Agreement is that countries have now 0 emission targets for the future. And that's typical of free riding. It's kind of greenwashing. It sounds nice, 2050, 2040, 2070 for this sector or for the whole economy. But yeah, that's so easy to say without any implications for now. And look at this graph. There are so many ways to go to that target. You can go very quickly, as under the green curve, or you can go more gradually, proportionally through the blue curve, or the purple curve with the gray area. You increase first, and then very late you decide, Jesus, we have a target. Let's quickly reduce emissions, and probably you will not meet that target and will go over it, as the broken line indicates. So I think 0 emission targets are a typical sign of free riding. Now I have to say, I'm also aware, and Mark, the organizer of this meeting, pointed me at some additional literature of political scientists who have tried to deny that climate and climate solutions are a public good, and that collective action and free riding are so important. And I was quite surprised by that. So I've been reading about that a little bit. And I have to say, I was surprised because it suggests that the logic has been wrong for decades in several disciplines, because in economics, psychology, and political science, it's been quite accepted that climate is a collective good. In fact, climate is seen, along with national defense, as one of the classic examples of public goods and collective action and free riding. So some of the authors I mentioned here, Eklink and Eklin, and I write the name wrong, it's without a K, Eklin and Mildenberger, they argue that it's more logical, it's better to understand climate solutions as distributive conflicts. Now, I don't deny that there are distributive conflicts at the global level and at the country level, but I don't think these undercut the fundamental characteristic of free riding and public goods. What they do at the global level, they reinforce free riding, especially by poor nations, because for poor nations, meeting the harmonized standard internationally will be difficult, and that needs definitely compensation. And the rich countries, they don't see that, but this is part of the agreement making, and also of the agreement theory that compensation in some agreements is essential to get good results. So I don't think it undercuts the free riding. It just says that we need to approach it in a different solution way. Then within countries, of course, there is inequity, there are vested interests, but they just reinforce the free riding by the government. So again, I don't think it undercuts the free riding, it reinforces the free riding. So another argument that I see is that deniers don't see, have certain views on policy. And so they regard in several cases subsidies as an effective unilateral policy. And they see this as positive. So they say, we see that several countries have subsidies, and that means that unilateral policies have a chance, or even that low carbon prices they see positive. Low carbon pricing means that there is unilateral policy. Ironically, in other writings, some critics say that low prices are ineffective, and I agree. So this argument is not completely convincing. Now, I have to say that for me, unilateral policy that is significant is policy that has serious regulation and serious carbon pricing. So I cannot agree with this judgment of the critics. So another line of thinking comes from Lepicier and Mildenberger. Their evidence is one case, the UK, which has almost 10% lower emissions due to arguably unilateral policy. Well, I'm willing to believe this. I could be critical of that, but I have two other easy criticisms. One case is overgeneralized. So what about the rest of the world? 194 countries. I can mention so many countries that don't show unilateral serious policy. So one case we generalize as evidence. Come on, that's not serious science. Moreover, that study neglects that the cost of emissions reduction, what economists call the MAC, or the marginal abatement cost curve, will increase sharply for higher emissions reduction, and then countries won't be eager to go there. So we will stop quickly at 10 or 15%, and then it will become very difficult. So unilateral policy is not going further than that and will not solve climate change and will not achieve deep decarbonization. So then the third study by Beiser and McGrath-Benauer says that from stated preference studies for the USA and China, it's found that people are not worried what other countries do. They are willing to have very stringent climate policies. Well, stated preferences, and also for China, it's not a democracy, so stated preferences of citizens in China have no influence on policy making. In the US, maybe a little. But what I think is more important is revealed preferences, meaning what do citizens vote and what do politicians actually implement in terms of policies. And from that, I derive other signals. I'm not optimistic there. So I think be careful with interpreting stated preferences. So all in all, I must say, for me, and I don't use easily strong wording, but I find this denial of climate solutions as a public good and related to free riding absurd. I find it really absurd. It won't bring climate solutions closer, rather the opposite, I think. So next argument, the final argument against critics is that they fail to offer a systematic instrument comparison. So they focus often on one criteria, which is not often made explicit, and then that supports their choice of an alternative instrument. But I think we need to look coldly at various instruments and various criteria. You cannot favor or dislike one instrument based on one dominant criterion. I think that's not good science. We should be more subtle like that. Of course, no instrument is perfect. And that's important. We have to assess the relative performance of instruments versus other instruments. Carbon pricing, as I already argued, and I will show an overview, scores surprisingly well on all criteria. And we should be happy about this, because it's difficult to find such an ideal instrument, and it simplifies matters a lot. I think effectiveness should also be well assessed. That means we should adopt a systemic perspective looking at direct and indirect emissions, accounting for energy and carbon rebound, accounting for international leakage when you don't have policy harmonization. And I think also efficiency should be appreciated, as I said, because it's important for a smoother transition. So this is my summary of the enormous literature that compares instruments. And I'm sure that we could disagree on some things, but it's a starting point for discussion. So what I do here, I have 4 categories of instruments: carbon pricing, technical standards, adoption subsidies, and information provision. And I have 4 performance criteria: effectiveness, equity, efficiency, and the famous 3E criteria. And global harmonization, which should be clear by now, is for me extremely important, because we are not going to implement strong policies at the country level if we don't harmonize and thus overcome free riding by these countries. So green means relative good performance, orange intermediate, red relatively bad performance. And it may surprise you, but technical standards and adoption subsidies don't score so well. And why is that? Well, they don't take care of rebound. That's one reason why effectiveness is not scored well. In terms of equity, they also don't do so well because there's no revenues for compensation, and adoption subsidies have an additional argument against them, as I will discuss in a moment. Efficiency, well, that's clear. That's a traditional argument. It's very clear that carbon pricing selects the cheap options much better, and technical and subsidies even cost money. In terms of global harmonization, it's also clear carbon pricing is the instrument that can harmonize. These other instruments are very difficult in this respect. So the other green cell is here. Information provision scores well on equity. Yeah, because it leaves people free. So you're not forced in an inequitable position, basically. But at the other side of the medal is that information provision is very ineffective on its own. It can work well in combination with other instruments, particularly carbon pricing, as I will show. But on its own, meta-analysis and review studies show it cannot do much more than 5% of emissions reduction. But we need 100% of emissions reduction, maybe. So I promised to say something about instruments and equity. So still, it's sometimes said carbon pricing is inequitable. Yes, if you don't account for the revenue use. So here you see a graph of revenue use in different applications of carbon taxes. We see many different decisions, which are not always consistent with what is recommended now. So compensating poorer households is absolutely relevant for political feasibility and for honest fairness and equity, of course. It's also not realized that other instruments are inequitable. Adoption subsidies, especially, if you give them to electric vehicles or rooftop solar PV systems, then they end up in the pockets of well-off, relatively rich households. Poor people don't have a car. They don't have an own house, so they cannot enjoy these. Poor people who have a car will also not so quickly buy an electric vehicle. And many people that have an electric vehicle have that as a second car, and that's why, you know. And then on a global scale, of course, revenues are important. So it would be nice to have an automatic mechanism like carbon pricing to generate them, because we have seen already from the climate negotiations since Paris that it's so difficult to get all rich countries to support climate finance. And if in countries at the national level, there is a commitment that might be lost if there is a government change. But if we have an automatic generation through an international carbon price, it will be more difficult. So I already said something about carbon markets. And of course, it's important to decide what you prefer, a carbon market or a carbon tax. A carbon market is generally less popular than a carbon tax among critics, among climate policy researchers generally, and among the general public. That's what I derive from all kinds of opinion studies and expert reviews. So I myself used to be also pro-carbon tax, but then over time I became more indifferent, and now I'm clearly pro-carbon market. And apart from the reasons which I gave already, I have a few more arguments here. First of all, the carbon market is so far the only instrument that has been able to harmonize climate policies. Look at the EU ETS, 30 countries. There is no other example for other instruments, neither for carbon taxes. It's difficult to cancel for national governments, so it's not sensitive to political winds. And it's also not so sensitive to crisis. Look now with the Ukraine situation, high energy and electricity prices. In many countries, energy taxes, a lot of energy taxes have been cancelled. Nobody has questioned the EU ETS. Interesting, not even right-wing parties. It's accepted. It's an institution outside the power of national governments, and that's good. It's stable. It's stable against crisis. Despite low expectations of skeptics in the past, the EU ETS has steadily reached high prices. Look, here is a graph. So in the last year, here's 2010, the July is a bit confusing here. So here's 2010 at 19, sorry, at the beginning, 2020, 2021. And this year, it has been largely between 75, 80 and 100. And this drop is the Ukraine crisis, the beginning. This drop is the expectation about a global crisis, and now it's gone up again, which is also not bad, because if there is a crisis, then there's less pressure on emission permits because there's less investments, etc. The carbon market will also be a stabilizer against economic crisis, and that's also good. And it's been so successful, in fact, that the European Commission wants also carbon markets now for buildings and transport. Also nice about carbon market is that it's automatically responsive to all kinds of changes in reality, which might reduce the effectiveness of other instruments: technological change, consumer fashions, economic growth, inflation, shifting trade patterns, and changes in sector structure. If you want to adapt your carbon taxation to that, you need political debate and you will meet political resistance. And again, change of government from left to right or so, it will make it difficult. Then I want to make a few comments about the policy mix, because I'm not in favor only of carbon pricing. I realize that we need multiple instruments, but I'm not so optimistic about multiple instruments as most others in the literature. So first of all, I want to identify a policy paradox. If you have more instruments, many people think that's better. Eh? It all adds to emissions reduction. No, that's not true. If you have more instruments, you also harm the comparability between countries, which hampers global harmonization. And as a result, you don't overcome free riding. And then weak policy continues. So more instruments may go against strong policy. So if you have a simpler policy mix, also if you then see that the policy mix is not doing what you want, it will be evident which instrument has to be set more stringent. But if you have a complex policy mix, you may not understand what is the cause of the problem. So complexity can also work against understanding how you can improve your policy. And then the third comment that I want to make is related to the graph here. If you design a policy mix, it's important to combine instruments that have synergy, positive synergy, and to avoid instruments that have negative synergy, especially the ones that have very low joint effectiveness or even backfire. And you could see that in this graph. So we have two instruments, simple case, A and B effectiveness. If you would combine them, you might have an effectiveness that's just a sum, but that's not guaranteed. That's a simple case. Positive synergy means you have more than A plus B, negative synergy less than A plus B. Backfire, that you have even a worse performance of the combination of the mix than one of the instruments or both of the instruments in the worst case. So an example of positive synergy is carbon pricing and innovation support. They affect short, medium versus long-term effects and decisions. You could also see them as trying to incorporate environmental versus knowledge externalities. So from various perspectives, you can see them as complementary. Of course, innovation support generates new technologies that through carbon pricing can be adopted. Another way to see it. If you talk about negative synergy, an important case is in Europe and also in the US, the combination of energy targets, especially renewable energy targets, and carbon markets. If you have the two, the joint emissions reduction won't necessarily exceed the ETS cap, the carbon market cap, because that renewable energy is part of energy companies that are part of the emissions market. So what you will do in the worst case, not change anything. The renewable energy targets have no impact. In the worst case, that the renewable energy targets substitute for cheaper options to reduce emissions. And then the cost goes up, but because of the cap, your emissions don't reduce further. And this, in fact, there are several studies that have shown that this has happened both in the US and in the EU. And in both, it's complex because there are sometimes national policies and state or country policies which interfere with each other, and they're implemented all with good intentions, but the outcomes are not necessarily good. And then another interesting synergy is what we found in a study that was published last year, where we combined carbon pricing with social networks. So what we wanted to do is see if you have carbon pricing in markets, how does it change the behavior of some people? And if you have social networks and people are sensitive to either examples they see from others or opinions they hear from others, how do they change their behavior? So we found that for realistic, we try to empirically motivate it well, the model. For realistic parameter values for Spain, where we work, the effective carbon tax could be 38% lower than if there were no social interactions. And we also could argue that with network policies, you could even increase the social multiplier through comparative information, what other people do in your network, in your income group, in your social cultural group, through social marketing, through giving awards for good behavior. So that's interesting. So we see that we don't have policies that are working. That's, I think, what many of people who are studying climate policy agree on. So what can we do? We see in reality and also in academia that many play the moral card. We suggest that most individuals can voluntarily change their behavior, that governments, national governments, or even supranational governments like the EU should unilaterally implement strong policies. Or we blame the oil companies and we urge for divestment for fossil fuels. All hasn't worked. Or we criticize growth and we come with degrowth and anti-capitalism. I don't think there's time for it, and I also question whether that's realistic enough. But okay, that's another debate. So all of these good intention strategies really haven't worked. Materialist lifestyle remains dominant. Weak public policies, focus on soft instruments, no significant overall divestment. The fundamental problem, in my view, is that none of these strategies tries or is able to overcome free riding. Free riding seems not to be part of the critics' vocabulary also, I think. So the only way to overcome free riding, that's my final point, is that we need to found a climate club with carbon pricing. In fact, we can learn from the reality. Past agreements like the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, and which transformed into the World Trade Organization, they started as a club, as a coalition. The EU, which is now composed of 27 or 28, I'm always confused, countries, 27 without the EU, without the UK, I think, started as a smaller community of countries around the North Sea. So it's logical, because if you try to set up an international agreement with countries that are so diverse as we have in the world, with 195 countries, then the weakest part of the chain is going to determine the outcome. So if you can set up a climate club with a joint coordinated policy, then you can overcome free riding within that club, not in the whole world yet. You can have a uniform carbon price and a protective carbon border tariff on imports from non-members. So then what happens is that you create pressure on non-members in two ways. Political pressure, because you can talk at the United Nations meetings with one voice, and economic pressure through the border tariff. So that means the club can expand, because some non-members will decide it's better to be a member of the club than to be outside and having that pressure, those two pressures. In fact, with the border tariff, there's a lot of literature on that now. The revenues could also be used for the climate fund to help other countries, or even given back to countries of origin to show the goodwill and also to reduce the risk of trade wars. That might sound strange. You might say, if you give the money back, then it's not effective. No, that's not true. That's the same as giving money to poor people. If you have carbon pricing, you still have changed the relative prices of high and low carbon options. So you will change the behavior of everyone. So how do you start a club? Well, with ambitious countries that have equal intentions. Probably also with important trade partners, because there's less risks of trade effect, of a competitiveness effect. Perhaps you have to compensate for inequity. Because inequity could be, if you, for instance, want China and the US and the EU in it, well, there's differences. Maybe we might compensate China because China has more to lose there. The EU ETS is already kind of a club. it's already harmonized through the EU ETS, and it's even considering right at this moment a border tariff. If we could get the EU to work together in this respect with the USA and China, I think we would solve climate change very quickly. So my advice would be we should focus on that. That's the main focus of these three blocks. Biden has said that he is also open to a border tariff to implement stronger policies within the US. The advantage of three partners is that it's a negotiation with few participants. 3 participants is not too complicated. And if the USA would change to Trump in the future, not completely unlikely, you might consider a multi-level club. I have an interesting study on that here mentioned at the bottom, where we looked at subnational provinces and states on the west side, the east side, the north, and even the south of the US, which might be motivated to be part of an international club. Some of these states, of course, like Texas, New York, California, are as big countries in terms of emissions, so they're quite important. At the north side, many would be interested to be a part of a club if Canada would be part of the club, because then they wouldn't have to pay this border tariff. Many of these border states, also in the US, they have quite high international trade relationships with the EU. So also for that reason, they might be convinced to be part of a club. So that's interesting too. Even if the US as a whole would be part, big states might be part, and that might also have a triggering effect within the US. We have to try to think of any mechanism that does the job, I think. So this leads finally, this is really my last slide before I come to the conclusions, to a dual track approach, which can maximize the chance of success. So the first track would be this climate club of countries, and the second track, the ongoing United Nations COP meetings following the Paris Agreement. So there are like, it's kind of a transition, that's a popular concept nowadays also, a dual track transition with 6 stages to a full agreement. So first, coalition speaks with one voice at the United Nations meetings. The coalition lobbies for a focus on carbon pricing. Lessons learned from the coalition can be transferred to the other countries and to the international agreement. Then the coalition gets bigger and bigger. There's critical mass, and then for all the remainder countries, it is logical, it's rational to become a member. So I have an article on that if you're interested. So here's my summary. Critics don't offer compelling arguments against carbon pricing. They show little concern for systemic effectiveness of climate policy and regard efficiency as the main reason for carbon pricing, which is not true. And this also means maybe that economists have a better job to do in explaining carbon pricing. Critics question the effectiveness of carbon pricing, but ignore the already rich and diverse empirical literature providing evidence to the contrary. I also think that many critics have an unrealistically high expectations about emissions reduction from low carbon pricing. So they are negative about carbon pricing as it works now, but they don't see how low the prices are and that there are effects according to empirical studies. So they confuse basically small emissions reduction with statistical insignificance. Critics overstate political barriers for CP, conveniently ignoring that all stringent climate policy, regardless of the instrument, has proven difficult. Critics focus too much on absolute features of carbon pricing without comparing and judging these fairly in a broader setting. And finally, I think the main alternatives that many critics propose, innovation and industrial policy, are not substitutes, but complements for carbon pricing. So what are the sources of resistance? Well, several factors may explain this. I think many critics show incomplete and superficial knowledge of relevant literature on theory and empirics in carbon pricing. Maybe they might know it, but they don't show it, at least in their publications. And I also don't see any reference in their studies to other literature that rigorously compares instruments of climate policy. And then I see behavioral biases, which are typical of humans: conformism, availability bias to the information they already have, not searching for other information, making a straw man of economics, as if carbon pricing only works if we are all perfectly rational agents and markets work perfectly. I don't think that's true, and a lot of other studies show that, a lot of empirical evidence also undercuts that. cherry picking in evidence, anecdotal evidence against carbon pricing, etc. Recurring argument of critics, namely that carbon pricing lacks sufficient political support, overlooks that unfounded criticism can weaken such support. So weak support is not a law. We're not having a law like in physics, some laws exist. So I would like to ask critics to fight for better implementation and getting more support rather than immediately throwing the baby away with the bathwater. So I would ask critics in debates on carbon pricing to be also explicit on the key criteria they employ and how distinct instruments score in their perspective. So I think we need more public debate between disciplines on climate policy and also in journals. But my experience is that many editors find articles that are new more interesting than responses to existing ones. Our science is not very open to real good debate still, I feel. That's a pity. And I think, as I suggested already, that economists have to improve their communication of carbon pricing. They should motivate it using a broader set of arguments. Emphasize that its aim is not public revenues, but altering relative prices and thus behaviors towards low carbon choices. And stress that revenue use is important. And perhaps they should use terms like dividends and tax shifts more. That the idea is not that we increase tax pressure, because that's not really the idea of carbon pricing. So here's my conclusions, my overall conclusions, a balance of arguments. And visually, I want to show that the arguments of the supporters weigh heavier than those of the critics. So here I stop, and I thank you for your attention.
So thank you very much, Professor Van den Bergh, for your participation. And we look forward to continuing collaboration and discussion on these important issues.
Thank you very much for the chance to talk to another audience for some time. Yes, thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup.